Welcome everyone to this talk of a look at a data scientist lead who is Adit Mehta from Cape AI. I'm Widad Anabtawi, the organizer of this talk on behalf of Fruit Punch AI and on collaboration with Cape AI. After this talk, we will send you, Adit will send you a follow-up email including the recording for this talk. And also, if you have any question, please feel free to write it on the chat, and I will address it to Adit. And at the end, you are allowed to unmute yourself. So, Adit, hi, Adit, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak. And good evening, everyone. So as Virat mentioned, my name is Adit Mehta, and I'm currently the lead data scientist at Cape AI. And I really want this session to be engaging, although it's difficult for me to actually follow, questions that may come up in the chat, or if someone has a question as the presentation progresses. So what I will encourage is that if you're feeling brave enough, please unmute, go ahead, ask me a question. Don't be shy to interrupt. If not, then I'm going to block out some time at the end of the presentation for us to just, have a conversation about some of the stuff that I've actually been speaking about. Yeah, and I'd like it to be as engaging as possible. So thank you all for making the time to join this talk. Hopefully you walk away with some sort of value. And that actually brings me to exactly what I want to talk about in today's presentation. So that is value. So value is a term that I think we use quite a lot in many, many different contexts. However, its definition sort of holds true, right? And I think very rarely perhaps we give thought to actually what value is. Now, put quite simply, value is something that has importance or worth, all right? So just keep that in the back of your mind, something that has importance or worth. Now, if we take that and we apply it to the context of this presentation, what I'd like to leave you all with today by the end of this talk is for you to understand value by data scientists and understand what value is for data scientists. Now, the way I've structured my slides are actually quite deliberate, where you'll see that the for data scientists happens to be within this little gray block. And that's because when we touch on that stuff, more of the softer side of things, that does become more of a gray area. Things are not necessarily very scientific, and it becomes a lot trickier space to actually navigate. Now, for anyone working in the data science space, working in some sort of a leadership role, whether you're leading a project, whether you're leading a team, you're going to have to seriously give thought to what value means to your people and what value your people have to bring to your environment. So let's unpack this a bit more. Value by data scientists always starts off around solving the right problems. So if you're data scientists, or if you have a team who solve the right problem, you would have created value. You would have created something that has importance or worth. Now, in order to actually solve these right problems, the way I see it, there are essentially four things which come together to actually create value by data scientists. The first one is process understanding. Now, I'm going to dive a little deeper into this onto the next slide, but process understanding on itself, the value of that cannot actually be understated. And I think I've sort of been on both ends of the spectrum in my career, where process understanding was actually not given importance and process understanding was given importance. And I've seen the difference in results come out on both sides in a data science context. Process understanding coupled with tooling basically gives you the platform to apply data science techniques within cross-functional teams. And in doing so, what you would have achieved is you would have created value. So let's unpack this a little bit more. presentation seems to have frozen. Can you all still see my slides?
Yeah, but you are still at by data scientist. Is it the right one?
No, that's not the right one. Sorry about that. I'm just going to give this, I'm going to reshare my screen. Can you tell me which screen you're seeing at the moment?
By data scientist solving the right problems.
Okay, perfect. Now can you see process understanding as a slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, this will actually go nicely into the part of my presentation that I'll touch on at the end. But, so let's just recap. So data scientists add value when 4 things come together. Those 4 things being process understanding, tooling, applying data science workflows, and operating in cross-functional teams. Now, like I mentioned, process understanding is an underserved area of the data science problem-solving process. And here's why. At the end of the day, what every data scientist needs to do and what every successful data science team needs to do is they need to be able to tell a story, all right? And this story is usually a narrative of different events that take place, different processes that take place that talk to each other. And it may not be linear like I'm showing in the slide, but basically you need to tell a story. Because in telling a story, you'd be able to identify a problem and you'd be able to communicate how that problem needs to be solved. So the very first thing which you need to do when you're understanding the process of any environment that you're working in, where you want to solve a problem using data science, you need to understand the data touch points. Now, these data touch points are basically different areas in your business, in your environment, in the organization that you're working, where data sets and data exists, all right? And each of these data touch points basically serve a specific function. Now, once you've mapped out these data touch points, it's important for you to get alignment on what these data definitions are. So let me explain. You would have been, let's say, going into an organization and you need to solve a problem for them. And you discover that they've got a ton of data that's sitting in a warehouse somewhere. That's fantastic. That's a win. You've got data to work with. The problem comes in when you take that data and you try and actually transform it into something that is useful for your client or whoever to actually get value from. What you'll find is there'll be misalignment in your interpretation of what that data means and their interpretation of what that data means. There might also be misalignment in terms of what that data is used for and what you are using that data for. So once you've mapped out data touch points, what you want to do is you want to get data definitions and alignment with your stakeholders right. Now, once you've actually gotten that right, the next thing for you to actually realize, and this will almost happen naturally, is that there will be gaps in your data. And there will be plenty of gaps, and you sort of need to mentally prepare yourself for this. And these gaps come along the processes, and they come in the forms of data being duplicated in many different spots, people using the same data for many different purposes, or actually a lot of missing data. And I'm not just talking in the traditional sense where data scientists need to, impute missing values or deal with missing data. But the thing is, to your process, what does missing data mean? What are the gaps in the knowledge for that data as well? So you've identified different data touch points, you get alignment within your environment on what all of that data means, and you will naturally start to find gaps in that data. So you would need to address these gaps, and that sort of falls part of the data science workflow and the data science process. So rather than worrying too much about that, the main thing is to just recognize where the gaps are. Once you've recognized the gaps, what's key in this entire process understanding is to recognize what are different outputs within this process. All right. So what I mean by this is there are people who are currently using the data that you're going to be looking at. Now, at each point, there are people who play a certain part, who produce certain outputs, all right? And then these outputs get passed on to people And the most simplest way that I can give an example of this is maybe a management report. So you have some analyst sitting somewhere who's using the data that you found, and they produce a certain report. And then that report gets sent to an executive somewhere. Now, why it's key for you to actually understand the outputs along the process is because you will start to then fill in some of these data gaps that you have. You will understand why certain data looks the way it does because of the associated output that it has. The outputs also start to talk to what value is trying to be delivered to the environment. So data touchpoints, data definitions, gaps come along. And if we take the time to identify what the different outputs are, we start to get a more holistic understanding of our environment. We start to understand the processes that affect what we're trying to solve. Now, underlying all of this is essentially the matter of tooling. Now, here's what I mean by tooling. Tooling, as most of us would actually interpret it, are the things that are going to help you to actually solve the problem. So it's great that you've understood your entire process, but now you need to start moving towards a point where you're actually going to solve the problem. And that's where the cool, hard, very clearly defined data science actually comes in. The thing about tooling, though, is often what I've noticed is data scientists have at risk of coming in with preconceived notions of what the right tooling is for a particular problem to be solved. And that's because globally we see, literature always points to certain tools always being used to solve a particular problem. And so it's almost natural for you to assume that these tools are the right tool sets. But what I'm implying here is that in this process understanding that you're going through, you need to take the time to identify what are the tools that are currently being used and then identifying whether they're suitable or not. Because if you go into any business process and you want to solve the problem using data science techniques and you almost dictate what the right tooling is going to be, chances are you're going to hit a lot of roadblocks in actually taking your thing from concept into actually production and to adding value. So take a second to recognize what are the tooling, what tooling is required in order to solve this process, in order to deal with the problems within this process. So at this point, I want us to just recognize that at the end of this entire process understanding exercise, what you'll walk away with are essentially three different things. The first thing you'll walk away with is knowing what problem you're trying to solve because you've done your homework. You've gone and understood the business process. The second thing is in order to solve that problem, you'll know what is the data that you're working with. And then the third thing, which is extremely important, is knowing who your data sorcerers are. So I just want to bring your attention to the spelling there of sorcerers. It is actually intentional, and what I'm referring to here, it's sort of like a play on the words, but essentially the people who are going to help you get access to that data. Those people are the magicians. If you make friends with those people and you have those people on your team, you have already gotten through a significant number of hurdles without having actually had to battle with it. So in order to solve a problem, using data science, you need to know what you want to solve, you need to know what data you're working with, and you need to know who are the people who are going to help you to get and understand that data. So at this point, like I said, the process understanding and the tooling, coupled with a data science workflow in cross-functional teams, allows data scientists to solve the right problems. And when you solve the right problem, you add value. And remember, the whole crux of this presentation is about value creation. So let's have a look at the data science workflow in cross-functional teams. Basically, this here is not necessarily something that's foreign to a lot of data scientists. It is all about basically combining many different techniques in order to solve the problem that you've already identified. The hard part, like I mentioned, is in the process understanding, which is the first step. But once you've done that and you know what problem you need to solve, then most data scientists can essentially just go into a process of first doing some research, scanning the landscape, identifying, what is the relevant literature that's going to help me solve this problem? What are existing tools and techniques that are used to solve this problem? Who else in the world has solved the problem similar to this? Can I learn from them? Can I apply what is already there so I don't have to reinvent the wheel? So research is almost like a key point in actually kicking off your data science workflow to add value. The second thing is you want to spend a lot of time actually doing data analysis. Now, this might sound silly, and I guess it also like changes from context to context depending on how much pressure you're under. But a lot of people tend to overlook the value of data analysis and actually doing exploratory data analysis on the data that they're working with. But the problem is, if you don't give your EDA enough attention, then what's going to happen is you're going to move further into your data science process, but you're actually going to be using incorrect interpretations of your data. You're going to build models that don't make sense. You're going to engineer features that don't make sense. And ultimately, you won't be adding value. And if you don't add value, then someone does not find that thing important or that it has worth. So exploratory data analysis is key. It's going to tell you the intricacies about your data that is going to inform every other step in the data science workflow process. Once you've explored your data, and this actually might go hand in hand with the EDA, but you want to engineer good features. Now, process understanding again kicks into this. And the reason process understanding kicks into this is because you understand the environment that you work in. You understand what is the problem that needs to be solved. And so that means you'll be able to apply your thinking in terms of what are intuitive and valuable features that are going to help me solve my problem. So spend a lot of time engineering the right features as opposed to just, randomly throwing in random features into your model. I guess it may work in some cases, but good luck trying to explain that to your business who actually will be asking a lot of questions around the intuition behind you choosing your features. Once you've engineered your features, then you just need to go into the model development and model serving process, which is really just about experimenting with the right techniques to actually solve your problem, to get the best results. And a point that's not mentioned on the slide here, but that's quite key in this process, is what is your success metric? Because if you go ahead and you build a model and you are communicating the value of this model, you need to be able to communicate what success means. And so in some cases, that might be an accuracy, an F1, but it doesn't matter what it is. All that matters is that you've defined it and you've agreed on it with your business stakeholder. And all of this is basically accomplished at a much faster pace and with a higher level of efficacy if you're working in cross-functional teams. And what I mean by cross-functional teams are basically a team that composes of different skill sets, not just data scientists. Because the data science workflow itself doesn't come to life and doesn't add value if you don't have your engineers, if you don't have your software developers. I'm not a big fan of bulky teams, but if you wanted to go and put in a business analyst there as well to do the process mapping, by all means. But basically, if you're a data scientist, you're not just going to be doing data science. You need to be able to straddle and you need to be able to expand your skills to work across this entire workflow. Because in doing so and bringing all these skills together, you would actually be adding value. Now, this data science workflow is more or less a very structured process. It becomes science at this point, right? Which means we can navigate it. Uncertainties can basically be dealt with, and we sort of know what we don't know. And if we don't, then we can actually go and just research and find out. The thing that actually gets quite exhausting and tiring is the fact that this entire workflow often needs to be repeated. And why this happens, whether you like it or not, it's going to happen, is because at every point in your work where you're trying to add value, you're going to need to relook at your processes. You're going to have to understand how is your environment changed? What are the new data points in your environment? Who are the new stakeholders who are important in your environment? And how do these affect the value that you're trying to add? And once the process changes, all the other steps change. You would have to constantly be doing new research. Perhaps new techniques come out, as we know that new techniques are coming out every single day. Perhaps you stumble across new ways to analyze your data. Perhaps you think of a new way to actually engineer a feature. Perhaps you find a new model architecture that can be fitted that gives you better results and takes you closer to your success your desired success metric. And so don't walk into a data science problem with the intention and mindset of not having to repeat this process. And that's sort of core to data science. It's about repetition and it's about continuous improvement. Once you've nailed all of this down, you would essentially be able to create value by data scientists. Sorry, by data scientists would essentially be the ones creating value. So at this point, what I'd like to do is I'd like us to actually have a look at the other side of the coin, which I spoke about, which talks about the grayer area, which now we move into people management. We move into teams. We move into essentially, how do you get and create value for the people who need to create value? I'm going to repeat that. You need to create value for people in order for people to create value. All right. So we've created value on the one end of the spectrum, which were the data scientists who are adding value. But actually, what we need to do is we need to understand what are the triggers at this early stage for these people. And so I'm quite a big proponent of values-based leadership. And essentially, values-based leadership says, let us bring everything back to that which is important to people, that which people values. And your leadership style is essentially driven, and all your decisions and actions are driven from your core values. So as a leader in a team, what you need to do is you need to do that introspection to understand what is it that's important to you. Because when you identify what's important to you, you would be able to translate your actions to creating value from the point within you that is truest, that is most authentic, and that is most genuine. Now, if we have to get a bit more specific around this, essentially, what you need to do is you need to take time to understand what your team values. Now, I'm going to give you some examples here so that this point actually is driven home. And I've put it as the first point here because it's arguably the most important. So in understanding what your team values, you need to take the time to have conversations with them. And in having these conversations, you will either explicitly ask them and they tell you, or you'll discover along the way what's important to them. And so in data science teams, things that I found are pretty much common in terms of what people value is, in fact, any team for that matter, if you operate with transparency, if you operate with respect, with compassion, with empathy, then you basically are 50% of the way there in terms of getting your people, adding value to your people, and them adding value to an environment. But other things that I've also found in my experience that have come up as quite valuable and important to data scientists is, for example, intellectual stimulation and challenge. So when you're leading a team, you may not get the best out of those people if they're not being challenged, because a lot of data scientists actually value being challenged, being intellectually stimulated, right? So take the time to understand what makes your people tick, what makes your people energized, and try your best to actually give them opportunities to experience that. And in doing so, everything else downstream gets taken care of. Once you've understood what your team values, it's very important for you as a data science leader at this point to define your role. And here's what I mean by that. I personally have been through many different, let's say, transitions in leadership roles where I would have had, let's call it, an existential crisis, because you're trying to do too much. You're trying to be something for everyone. And the problem with that is, at a certain point, in a certain environment, that's not going to work. You're going to disappoint people at times, and that's okay. The thing is, you need to understand what is your role in your context. And this talks very closely to what your team values. Because what a lot of data scientists actually value is they value strong leadership. They value clear communication. They value confidence. And so as a team lead, what you need to do is you need to be firm in defining your role for yourself, because you then will be able to execute your role, and that'll satisfy what your people actually value. So define your role. If you're going to be a technical leader, be a technical leader. If you're going to be a semi-technical leader, be a semi-technical leader. And if you're going to be a non-technical leader, then be a non-technical leader. But make that decision and make sure that it aligns with the value that people have and with the value that you want to create. So define your role. Now you've understood what your people value. You've made your role clear. The next thing, which I feel is extremely important, whether you're technical or non-technical, is you've got to be in the data trenches. And what I mean by this is, along the way in trying to create value within a data science process, there are going to be days when things get really rough, all right, where the data just doesn't make sense. The models just don't make sense. Nothing actually makes sense. The process actually starts to not make sense. But if you are there with your people in the trenches, figuring things out, solving problems, fighting through the data with them, what happens is you actually start to build a lot more trust. You start to build a lot more confidence with your team. And when things get really tough, you'll find that it's actually those elements that keep your team going towards wanting to add value. Because to be honest, at times things can get difficult where you don't want to actually create that value anymore and you're ready to actually give up. But if you've shown your team members that you've been with them in the data trenches, that you recognize what's important to them and you recognize what's important for us to achieve as a collective, then together you can actually move forward a lot more definitively to adding value. So be in the data trenches with your people, solve problems, get your hands dirty, and don't be afraid to, just don't be afraid to dive in. And the very last thing that I want to touch on here in terms of adding value for data scientists is finding your anchors. Now, this point here is an interesting one that I've actually only realized with time, right? And it, as a leader in any industry for that matter, or any sort of environment, it's important for you to find anchors. Now, here's what I mean by anchors. Anchors are people who essentially contain a certain skill set, or they bring a certain value to your team, to your environment, all right? They are people who are really good at doing something specific, all right? Now, what happens is when you start to get distracted as a leader with having to do many different things. So on the one hand, you're trying to understand data. On the other hand, you're trying to understand process. And on another hand, what you're doing is you're trying to solve, I don't know, political issues within a business environment. It becomes almost impossible for you as a leader to add value to your people by trying to do too many things, all right? There also just isn't enough time in the day for you to make sure that you get every single thing right. So what happens and what this means is at this point, you need to find people who you can rely on, who will actually help you to speed up in learning, in doing, in understanding a particular concept, in understanding a particular framework, an idea, an environment, all right? So let me give you some examples of anchors. Data science is evolving so quickly that every single day, there are new methods to do something. There's a better way to do something. A benchmark, state of the art is sort of being challenged every single day. And so it becomes exhausting to keep up with the amount of research and development that's happening in the field. It's very possible that you find an anchor, someone within your team who is really good at research. And so that's great, because as a leader, you don't necessarily have to be the lead researcher unless you've defined that as your role. And so you can start to rely on that person to be your anchor when it comes to your research. So if you're good at just learning quickly, then you can rely on the skill sets of your researcher, the person who you know is going to keep you up to date with the latest. Alternatively, maybe you've got an anchor who is really, really good at presentations, all right? So now all of a sudden you've gotten to a point where you need to present to a client, but you've got too many things on your plate. You're not going to be the one there to actually deliver that presentation. You've got an anchor. You can rely on this person to actually execute on that. Or maybe more technically, one of your anchors could be someone who's just really good at, I don't know, maths and statistics, right? And so you don't have the time to understand every single, all of the nitty-gritty behind certain modeling techniques. But if you've got an anchor who can help you with that, then that's great. Now, there's an added benefit of this using and finding anchors. apart from just benefit to yourself. And that is that it starts to empower the people around you. It starts to empower the people in your team so that they become more motivated to actually add value. So think about it. If your leader has actually approached you and trusted you with helping him or her with something, wouldn't that actually send the correct messaging in your mind? Wouldn't that send messages of trust? Wouldn't that send messages of confidence? And so when you find your anchors and you truly trust and rely on your anchors, what you're doing is you're creating and adding value to a team, and together that team is then going to add value to another environment. All right. So let me just recap these 4 points on value for data scientists. It is understanding what people value. Take the time to find out what people's value systems look like. The second thing is define your role and stick to it. Well, regularly review it, but own your role. You've got to be confident in owning your role. If you start to show signs of being uncertain, that's where things will start to get a bit shaky for your team. The third thing, be in the data trenches, get your hands dirty. That'll get your people behind you a lot quicker. And the last thing is find your anchors, because you cannot know everything and do everything yourself. So what I want to do is, at this point, I want to touch on one last element towards data science in general, and that is building resilience. All right. As I mentioned, the field of data science is evolving so quickly that it becomes exhausting to actually keep up with things. Also, in a world that is changing so quickly, people's understanding of what value is, of what value data can bring to their lives, sort of changes quite regularly. And so you might find yourself in an environment where a target is perhaps moving far too often than it should be. What happens is in those situations, you need resilience. You need your team to have resilience. And resilience is essentially, the way I define it, a commitment to adding value. So when things get tough, resilient people are people who are committed to adding value. They're people who recognize that, hey, I've got to get up, I've got to dust myself off, and I've got to keep moving forward because I know what value I need to add. And then the second thing, which sort of leads on from this whole point of the resilience, is just taking a second to recognize that we're all human. And at the end of the day, what happens is when you want to add value, you've got to recognize that there are people involved. We're not working in a world where that is completely governed by just machines. And so if you want to create value by data scientists, and if you want to create value for data scientists, then what you have to do is you need to recognize that you've got human players in the system. So take the time to acknowledge everyone's humanness. Take the time to acknowledge that you yourself are humane, and a whole like string of values sort of get attached to that, things like patience and compassion. But it talks to why, for this entire presentation, all I've been driving home is the concept of value. Because value, as we said, is something that has worth or importance. And so if you want to make some sort of a difference to any environment that you're in other words, you want to create value, then you can do this by being resilient and by recognizing that you and everyone else around you are also human. And thank you very much. That's my talk. I finished it a lot quicker than I expected to, but if there are any questions, please feel free to unmute and ask me. I'd love to like engage in a bit of conversation around this. No questions, none at all. I see this one in the chat. Estimating project timelines is the bane of my existence. What is your process for generating realistic and competitive deadlines? Oh, that's probably one of the hardest questions to try and answer. Sure, I'm gonna give this a stab, right? So, in terms of generating realistic timelines, what I found is that with experience, sort of you get better at guessing. But the key thing that I sort of take away from that is your initial estimation is always going to be just a guess. All right. Which is, and so my way of dealing with the uncertainty of getting that guess wrong is by making sure that whatever I commit to upfront is sort of has a shorter cycle rather than committing to a long-term deliverable. Because what happens is if you've committed to a shorter deliverable, then you'll be able to, you'll be missing the mark, and that's cool, but you'll be able to readjust yourself very quickly and then start getting better at guessing after that. How to generate competitive timelines, that's a tricky one. I don't really know because now that I think about it, I don't necessarily think I've been in situations that have required me to generate competitive deadlines. I think it just goes back to the urgency of the environment that you're working in, right? If you've got problems that need to be solved really quickly, then you just don't have a lot of wiggle room. And so it's less of a process in generating those timelines and more of just getting dirty, getting enough resources, getting the right tooling. I hope that makes sense, Cam. Thanks for joining, Isaac. Are there any other questions, comments, thoughts? Chris has asked, how do you deal with difficult team members? So Chris, are you referring to people within my team or just difficult stakeholders in general?
In general.
Sure. Okay. So I guess by asking my question, I'm actually going to give you two different answers. Well, two answers. The first is when it comes to dealing with difficult team members, so people who are within your team. I think it boils down to like honest and sometimes difficult conversation. So I've always taken the approach of like trying to be an observer and a listener as far as possible. And so if someone appears to be difficult, I guess I'm going to give it some time to collect data for myself to understand what seems to be the triggers. And after that, what I do is I try to intervene with some sort of small action and that might just be perhaps changing the work that they're doing or making them work with someone different based on my observations. And if that difficulty sort of tends to not be mitigated after that, then I move to the point of actually engaging in conversation. And that conversation is really just about transparency, and it's about sitting down one-on-one and actually having a talk with them. Something that I've noticed works also really well, and I've actually been burnt by this before, is what you want to do is you want to praise publicly, but you want to criticize privately. And what that means is when you're sitting together with your team and you can see that someone's being difficult, or you can see that things are just not working out with someone, what you want to do is you don't want to reprimand them in front of everyone. I guess like our human egos are the most fragile thing about us. And so you don't want to actually tempt or challenge that. So praise publicly, criticize privately, but it requires a lot of courage to actually engage in that conversation. In terms of, I presume, Chris, you're referring to like difficult stakeholders, is that right?
I actually referred more to people within your immediate team that you're leading. But okay. Stakeholders as well, if you can address that, that'd be great.
Right. So I guess with stakeholders, one of the lessons I've learned along the way is that as much as you're there to, let's say if it's a client for that matter, as much as you're there to add value to them and you're there to help them, respect is a two-way street and it has to be mutual. And so at some point, you've got to just take the point of, we need to be professional here. And part of being professional means, again, engaging in some difficult conversation every now and then. Also, what I found is that your approach must never be, you should never have the perspective of wanting to sort of make things about conflict, but actually you should try and reframe things to be less confrontational in nature. And so if you just take the time to try and establish a bit of a relationship with a stakeholder who seems really difficult, that might work out. And at the end of that, or at the end of it all, you might actually just build a nice relationship with them, or you'll get confirmation that this person doesn't want to play ball, in which case you can take some difficult action after that. So it's a bit of a fluffy answer, but you know, fortunately I haven't had to deal with too much of that myself.
Thanks.
Cool. Albie has sent a message. What are some of the leading metrics / measurables to determine value? Data to determine the value that data science is adding to business. So I think Albie this year is going to be sort of context or environment specific, but I think at the end of the day, at its highest level, what I found is in business environments, it's going to come down to some sort of a revenue generation or some sort of a cost reduction. All right. The problem is, like, the value that data science brings doesn't always directly translate to making money or saving money. All right. So you might find that executives are the ones who set those targets for themselves because that's what they need to do. They need to change. They need to move the dial on the bottom line. But this is not necessarily a metric, but what I found is that there are some small wins along the way that data science provides that actually add value. And some of those things are, for example, data literacy. All right. You might find that in a business environment, you may not be able to save them money or save their money or make their money. But if you end up educating them on all of the different gaps in their data, you've added value. So it's hard to create a metric around that, but data literacy is key. If you're helping your business to actually understand the processes and all of the data touch points, you've added value. You will be surprised at how many businesses don't actually have a view of their entire have a view of the different processes that exist in their businesses. All right. So data literacy, process mapping, educating the business, maybe that's through some sort of a skills transfer. So you go in with a team of people who are really good at, you know, using Python, but the business you're working in doesn't actually know how to use those tools. Are you transferring those skills? That adds some serious value. So I think beyond just the revenue generation and cost reduction, which is often like project specific, there's many other areas where you can actually, where data science can add value to businesses. Does that answer your question, Albie?
Thank you, Adit. I think that adds another, it's almost like a byproduct. And yeah, some of the things you don't always look at that actually, yeah, experience and things that also gets carried over. So yeah, no, thank you for that perspective. It's very insightful.
You're welcome. If I may just add a little bit more to that. You see, one of the things that I found over the years is that the very first place that people's minds go to when it comes to, you know, them getting a data science team is that they're always thinking in terms of like a deliverable, all right? So they're saying that the value that I'm going to get from this team is a model, all right? The thing is, the model is not necessarily the value, okay? So that's why I always like stress the whole thing about like process understanding, because the value actually comes in solving problems, right? The value comes at creating solutions, but the solutions themselves are not what should be the focus. And so when you're defining metrics for what value is, don't think about it in terms of I need X, but think about what does X actually do to my business.
Thank you. Thank you, Adit.
You're welcome. Thanks, Albie. Are there any other questions, thoughts, comments?
I have a question, Adit.
Yeah.
So it's not always that we find ourselves in leadership positions. And I think many of the people on the call can, at any point in the day, be on either end of the leadership spectrum. So just flipping the script a little, I'd like to ask a question about personal leadership. When working in data science or tech teams, how does one deal with being in a position where the leader does not necessarily have a shared vision with the rest of the team?
So are you asked, sorry, did you ask how should people respond to that if their leader doesn't have that shared vision?
Yes, so how can one drive change in such an environment?
That's a really good question. And I guess that's why that falls within that whole, you know, gray area that I put in the presentation. I'm going to sort of talk out loud here, right? And like, please feel free to challenge me along the way. But you see, like, shared vision, usually where that goes wrong is when it's created from one perspective, all right? So vision itself, in many contexts, gets driven like top down, but actually it should be co-created in a lot of situations. So when it comes to teams, half of the problem is sort of mitigated if very early on you sort of co-creating vision, right? I think where this gets really challenging in practice is when, for example, you're new and you've joined a company and you weren't there at the point of, where that vision was co-created. And so my first thing that I would actually advise is that when there isn't shared vision, just take the time to observe. Just take the time to collect data for yourself to understand the vision that's there. Why is that thing there? All right. So before you actually go to the point of challenging that vision, understand why it's there. After that, what you want to do is you want to not just challenge that, but what you want to do is you want to propose alternatives to it. All right. So what happens is, like I mentioned, like the human ego is like very fragile. And so if you want to instantiate change as a team member, the last thing you want to do is actually go to a leader and be like, hey man, I don't align with this, or this is wrong. So what you want to do is you want to say, I've been thinking about this. What if this could also be our vision? What if this is an alternative to it? So start to engage in discussion. And then the third thing that I would do is actually, I'd start to find out how many other people don't share this vision. All right. So like maybe take a second to think about, is this just misalignment with yourself? Or is this broader misalignment with other people in the team and then the team's shared vision, right? Or yeah, whatever that was mandated to them. So I guess, yeah, it comes down to a lot of observation, a lot of patience, and I guess like common thread that seems to be coming from my answers here is like courageous conversation, right? If you really do want to be the person, if you really do want to instantiate change and change is valuable to you, then you will be the one to actually initiate that conversation. Hope that gives you some sort of clarity, Ivasan.
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Anything else? Would anyone like to share an experience that they may have had that is related to the stuff I've said? Okay, then I think we're done. Thank you so much for taking the time to join on this evening, Tuesday evening. I really appreciate it. I'm grateful for it, and I'm also really grateful for all the questions that have come through. I always appreciate, sort of validating that which I've spoken about, and I'm also grateful for the opportunity to share with you all. So thank you very much. Hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you, Adit, for this, I think, awesome talk and some advices, because I'm also facing some of problems, especially with team members. So thank you, everyone, for attending. And Adit will send you a follow-up email. I think you can send him an email of your questions. You get
Yes.
a new question.
I'm just sending my email address in the chat box now. If you want to have a chat, you want to grab a coffee, virtual or physical, let me know. Just pop me a mail, adit@kpai.com.
Yeah, you sent me private.
Oh, haha. There you go. Connect with me on LinkedIn and let's chat. Let's grow the community.
So thank you, everyone, and I hope you a nice day if you are like morning or afternoon, a nice evening if you are evening like us. Thank you.
Bye.